I'm going to talk today about how demography might be able to help us make better predictions of global vegetation dynamics and predictive vegetation models. And so there are a lot of different ways to predict and simulate forest. I'm talking about a particular flavor, and that's the parts of the vegetation models that link in and communicate with Earth system models. In other words, the ones that just carve up the entire globe, project everything forward through physics and chemistry, and predict the future of the atmosphere, carbon and temperatures and glacial retreats, et cetera. And there's a little part of it that's the land and a part of that that's forest. And we should feel proud that forests are so important, but it's a little embarrassing. The models make a lot of poor predictions, and a lot of it is because forests are poorly resolved in them. So, you know, the atmospheric physicists are like, is that it? No. There's only two moods. There's only like awake or asleep. Okay, either one. Yeah. So forests are responsible for a lot of the error in these models. So like the physicists working in oceans are like, we got this, we know physics. What's the matter with you guys? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about today. This is an example of some of the struggles that modeling forests poorly has on resolving the future carbon budget. This is the annual land flux in petagrams of carbon per year. This range reflects annually. This reflects, you know, a huge chunk of emissions. This is important. This is a big amount of carbon. And basically, these are models that run vegetation dynamics with different assumptions, different flavors, different levers and mechanisms. And the result is that some show forests responding by being really shocked by the future world and feedbacks and kind of shutting down and letting carbon increase a lot. And others show a positive response where forests actually like the warm weather, the longer growing seasons, and take up more. And resolving that's pretty important because those are two very different stories. You also might note that although there's a lot of uncertainty here, they seem to be pretty much in agreement through a bunch of this. So what happened in the 1980s that upset everything, I can think of a lot of things in the 80s that would upset things, but basically they have to get that right. This is one of the ways these model comparison projects work. You have to have benchmarks. So in other words, if you have a model that's going down here and doesn't hit the carbon and temperature and forest biomass benchmarks here, then you're not allowed to play in the sandbox. So that's also kind of remarkable that we're not even seeing all the bad models out there. We're seeing the ones that play together. And then they say, now let's predict the future, and they diverge. So they're all doing sort of the same thing. How could they disagree so much? I mean, a lot of the components are the same. Well, they have long and parallel and unique evolutions as models. In other words, they pretty much all started these surface energy models, and plants and plant canopies were added, and soil moistures and lakes and rivers, dynamic vegetation, where the vegetation not only responds to the atmosphere, but puts, determines the atmosphere. And land cover change, urban environments are included. So demography is now an important thing that they think should be brought to bear. But they're popping demography in after a long history. So they're not building from bare ground a demographic model. They're trying to fit in demography to a very complex system of models that have their own personalities and decisions. This is the way vegetation's treated those models, and if you don't get this, you shouldn't, because it's a lot of different scientists with different ideas on how hydrology and fire and everything works. And so you say, well, where does demography fit into this? How can we adjust this? You see these little pictures of trees? It's pretty much all we have. Like, basically I can say, this tree is different from this tree, and so all the stuff going on around it might be different, and it might respond differently. So turns out, those trees, these PFTs are very important in the models, but it's worth noting that we're not trying to change the demography through adjusting everything, just trying to tweak some of the personalities of these plant functional types. Plant functional types enter in right here at the bottom. You have different plant functional types like tropical, evergreen, et cetera. And they fill up these cells of these grids just the same way sun walls and roofs and shade walls fill up a city. So it's a really funny thing where you have these incredible important organisms that define a lot of the albedo and the surface fluxes. And they're as simplified as the sides of buildings in urban landscapes. Nothing against getting the urban side right. It's just we need to do a lot of work here in the PFTs of forests. And so here are 8 PFTs from the community land model. And a lot of these big models can't afford to have many more than 8. And you see that they're basically organized by latitudinal biome and leaf type informed deciduousness evergreen. And it's worth noting that, you know, it's not a democracy. You know, tropical forests are responsible for a lot of what's going on, tens of thousands of species, and there's 2 plant functional types. They're either deciduous or evergreen. And look, and the modelers know this. It's not, you know, this is, you know, I'm not pissing anybody off by showing this because they're like, what, you know, this is a problem. This is why we want demography in here. Might be able to help us reorganize these plant functional types better. So why would that be the case? Why would they be interested, let alone when I think it's important? There actually, you know, there's a lot of demographic data across these systems, if you think about it. One example is the Forest Global Earth Observatory that I work for, the Smithsonian. We have many plots around the world, millions of trees, 12,000 species, 15 million demographic estimates, and we're just one of the networks of inventory. So these data are pouring in, and we're also expanding. It's worth noting. As of yesterday, because I went out to Ordway Swisher, we have 67 forest plots. I know it was on without me being there, and so like Ordway Swisher fitting into this global thing. Well, I mean, part of the project is trying to represent global forests. So, you know, we have forest plots from around the Whitaker biome map, and we do seek out, you know, important regional forests, but ones that can contrast with, for example, Impala, which is a savanna system in Africa. Thinking about the Arctic, different mid-Atlantic sites, and of course the tropics where the network began. So in addition to the data, demography drives to a great indirect extent the carbon cycle and forests, which is what the modelers really are interested in. And it does it kind of straightforwardly. And growth and recruitment can add to the carbon pool in a forest. From now on, when I say growth, I really am talking about increase in wood biomass in the forest. And of course, mortality through decay, et cetera, takes carbon out of that pool. So you have very simple components of forest demography that we have a lot of data on that are responsible for the carbon pool as it stands and as it changes. So what I want to talk about today is how demography might drive forest dynamics and how those dynamics might be represented in vegetation models. And I'm going to start by kind of giving an overview of demographic vital rates as it pertains to trees, very much in just, you know, just the idea of how we're going to predict forests with them. Evolutionary demography is complex and varied, and there's a lot of really interesting stories to be told in these vital rates, but I'm going to kind of reduce them to what we're talking about in representation and models. I'm going to show an example of translating demographic PFTs across two different forests, whether they're different forest types, we'll see. That's just an example of kind of some of these first initial efforts to include demography and vegetation models. And then I'm going to finish with a global analysis of demography to kind of think about a little bit broader about how we might come at this problem of including demography in the models. So when I talk about growth in the context of these vegetation models, these are not trees growing where we take our observations and put them directly into like a stem model. They can't handle individuals. These models have huge pools of carbon, and they're built on physiology and not on demography. So they can back out some sense of individual stem size. If you have a carbon pool this big and a PFT of this age, that represents so many stems per hectare, for example. And you just chop up the carbon and say that's how much, this is how big they are with allometries. But if they pour a whole bunch of more carbon in that pool, they then calculate out, oh, now those stems are about this big. And so they don't necessarily have the constraints that we would think of making sense at the individual level. The stems could double in size just because there's a lot more carbon. And that's one reason why observed growth rates might be able to help us benchmark what that growth should be, what that carbon pool should reflect, and also inform us a bit about the processes. You know, when you're pouring carbon into this pool, does it make sense? And why would it or wouldn't it? And I'm going to talk about this in two contexts. One is the potential growth of trees, and the other is kind of the realized growth of trees. And that is, how much can you grow as a PFT or as a species, but how much do you grow? And And this is interesting to the models because you want to know, well, if all things are equal and everything's going well, what's your carbon increase? And if there are droughts, for example, disturbances or stress, how might that adjust that potential maximum? So using, so I'm going to use different sources of data here, and then it'll kind of be a little bit more synthesized in the global part. These are dendrometer band data from CERC. It's part of a really neat project. We've got great data coming out of this plot in Maryland, where we have between 100 and 400, depends on the year, trees with dendrometer bands measured every week. And this can give us resolutions of growth of about, well, precision is about 100th of a millimeter. So you can really see the little swells. And here's an example of that kind of data. We have thousands of these time series. This is an individual, it's about 84 centimeters in diameter, it's a big tree, in 2010, 11, and 12, same individual. And what I just want you to notice is that, the curve is fit to it. You can see that it bounces around during the year. And sometimes it bounces around a little, sometimes it bounces around a little more, and sometimes it deviates more. These bounces are generally dry down periods, just periods without rain. It can be a week or 2 weeks or more. And then it responds, things fill up. It can be hydrology, it can be carbon. So the question is, well, how much does this weather matter to the carbon cost? In other words, at the end of the year, does this hurt or are you just recovering? Well, if you look at the actual numbers of annual growth, you can see that almost 5 millimeters of growth is a lot. So a little bouncing seems to be doing fine. A little more bouncing reduces it a little bit, not much. But this protracted period resulted in a much smaller change in size by the end of the year, 1.8 millimeters versus 4.9 and 4.3. So is this just an individual response? We kind of backed out from our data what we would expect, and the whole forest showed this. So we backed out kind of what would be our expectation in terms of carbon of the whole forest during these years, based, interpolating with the rest of the data. And what you see is absolutely it matters. These 2 years, 2010 and 12, bounced around different ways to the same carbon result, megagrams per hectare. But this 2012 period, this extended little drought, even though it rained and recovered, it was too late. And that's a lot less carbon for a forest. So that's an interesting insight into suppression. And what I find really fascinating about this is that the whole story was told these different years by July 19th, give or take. Circuits, it's a warm, temperate plot. There's leaves on until late October, early November. But bold growth investment is here. And so not only is there a threshold of sensitivity, it seems to be, there's a temporal period of sensitivity. So it's an important kind of nuance that the models generally treat this as leaves on, you can grow. And this shows something a little different in terms of suppression. Now, what about potential growth? Here are 3 species from BCI and Panama. I was going to test, I didn't translate them into Linnaean. You guys probably know them anyways, but that's a joke. And what you see, 3 different types of trees. This is a 200 millimeters, so it's a smaller understory tree. This is an emergent. That's a kind of medium canopy. Growth rates have different patterns of growth, but I think one thing that's interesting about this is although this kind of spread may be different, what you do see is that whether you're small or large, the kind of maximum growth can still be achieved. This is just diameter growth, but my point just being that it's not like there's a fundamental limit when you're small. In fact, actually, you can grow in diameter, remember, but relatively fast. It's just you rarely do. And in fact, if you focus in on one of the species, all of the data are down here in that corner, essentially. This is the spread in diameter. This is the histogram. All the data are less than 10 centimeters in diameter. I mean, all this is just extra. And so if you fit a functional form to try to predict growth, it's just going to be dominated by those data. And the story is going to kind of be told by this density of suppressed individuals. And you're going to do a poor job predicting growth in the forest because the individuals that don't grow much here along this line don't even contribute to this part of the forest. They die out. So in other words, no individual follows this trajectory. It's the individuals that get lucky and bounce up here, maybe down at it, and then maybe up, but then end up here. So this is, so just basically taking growth data over size or age is kind of you can't just straightforward predict the dynamics of the forest. And so what we do in our work and what a lot of the models do is they just separate it out and say, do you have resources? Light is the big one in a lot of forests, or not? And if you have resources, what do you do with them? So instead of fitting the kind of functional form, we just look at the 5% fastest growers and the 95% slowest growers. We fit 2 gamma functions to them, but the difference in these curves can tell you a lot about what a species is capable of doing, when otherwise statistically it's kind of hard to gather that information. So the thing we need from growth is to get the consistency and degree of suppression correct. That's like what all those dynamics about drought suppression, when does it kick in and how much and what does it mean? And get the release with resources correct. So these are ways in which that can kind of inform some of the carbon story in these models. So survival is generally how we fit the model, but survival, of course, changes based on mortality. It's kind of, we think of the mechanisms as being mortality and the functional form being survival. So the mechanisms of mortality, which subtract from survival, of course, they're rare and variable in time. They're difficult to quantify. They're hard to recognize the mechanisms. Multiple things can happen. And we were out at Ordway Swisher yesterday, and just the fact that there can be a lightning strike and then a different fire burn and a little drought or not, and something can survive for another 30 years or not, and what caused that is kind of difficult to know. Biases can be influential over time. So it is important to get changes in these mechanisms, even if they're hard to detect. And long-term changes are difficult to detect. It's hard to detect phase changes in mortality. Like we used to grow, survive this much, and now there's just more droughts and we survive less. Unless it's catastrophic, it's hard to kind of capture that. So we generally, so what we're doing is we're fitting survival models to size and thinking about the ways these shapes may change, either based on species or based on conditions, based on droughts, et cetera. It just kind of is a way to smooth over all the chaos in the data and try to get a signal and understand it. And so, from this, for example, you can look at juvenile survival, which is what's survival when you're 1 centimeter, which is, just our entrance into our censuses. So that big. Your maximum survival rate, the kind of long term. And your stature is just how do you senesce? I mean, when you're at 50% mortality, which the game's pretty much over for that species, how big are you? And this can vary. This varies a lot and in important ways. And I just want to mention one thing in evolutionary demography. I mean, an important thing to think about is the decoupling of pre-reproductive and post-reproductive individuals. And you can have very different strategies with traits, with demographic rates, with plant defenses, you name it, before and after you're reproductive. And that's just because trying to get to reproduction is one thing. And then after you're reproductive, you can have entirely different strategies on how you try to replace yourself. So you can become reproductive and just keep, reproducing, maybe masked, maybe not, but for many years. But there are monocarps. In Panama at BCI, there's a monocarp where it gets to the canopy after many, many decades. It's in the canopy, full light, doing fine, competing flowers and dies. In any one year, maybe, when they do their die-off, maybe 20% of that population produces one crop and dies away. And those are just 2 strategies to try to get your replacement. You can bet hedge over a long time and hope something wins, or create a gap and hope that crop creates the next one. My point just being that the shapes of these curves can be really important. And part of the reason they're so important is that survival is multiplicative. It's the compounding interest problem. And so if you change those curves a little bit, and that curve stays different for a long time, it builds up really quickly to a place where you have different population dynamics, different structures of the forest. Show you an example here. So the x-axis is the proportion surviving annually. So I'm only showing you the top 10% of survival, annual survival. And this is years here. And these isoclines are basically what percentage of your population, if you start off with these annual rates, do you hit after so many years? And so, for example, if you have a 98% survival rate and you start off with 100 individuals, at about 25 years, 60% of your cohort is left. Another way of thinking about it is if you're an individual that has 98% survival, you have about a 60% chance of living 25 years from here. if you move down 2 percentage points, so now remember those curves, you're just talking about whoop, a little bit down, a little bit down. Now all of a sudden, you have a 35% chance of surviving 25 years. So you've gone from 60% to 35% with just a 2% drop. Now that is a big drop. That's it's doubling your mortality rate. But remember those curves, it's not a lot in the grand scheme of things. And so because of long-lived species do endure these conditions over multiple years, sensitivity to survival can be really important. So I'm gonna finish the vital rates part by talking about reproduction and sort of hinted at it, but the most important thing to remember when thinking about reproduction is the fact that over the course, all else being equal, stable population size, over the course of a tree's lifespan, it just needs one seed to become a reproductive adult for stable population. Okay, so you need to replace yourself essentially. And so evolutionarily, you think of it as a reproductive adult, creating a reproductive adult and passing on through DNA the strategies that helped you do that. So that's kind of the strategy going forward for you. That means that all of these beautiful seeds and the seeds in this whole canopy and the seeds next year and the year after, or 5 years or 10 years or 100 years, only one of them is going to become a reproductive adult. That means that it's really hard to translate reproduction, reproductive effort, or even the results of reproductive effort we see into the dynamics that might drive the population. You can watch failed crops 20 years, 30 years, but that's not the story. 1 year, everything's fine and population's good moving forward. We wanted to explore this a bit quantitatively and kind of in the context of what I've showed you. And this is work with a former postdoc and a colleague at Taiwan, Chi-Hao Chang-Yang. And Chi-Hao has an amazing data set he's worked hard on for the last almost 20 years now. It's seedlings in a forest, the Fushan forest, which is part of the network. It's a montane, subtropical montane forest in Taiwan. And he has thousands, well, tens of thousands of data from many, many, many seedling plots where he's followed for 18 years, different species of, number of different species of trees from the germinate stage. So just first flush through to the sapling stage, say entering, you can think about it as entering the census to 1 centimeter. What's remarkable about that is that few people have the dedications, patience, let alone the know-how and skill to recognize the species and do the math. Through the whole life history of the seedling stage. I mean, that's, a lot of them are just subsets and windows. So we were able to use, when he was in my lab, we were able to use these data and we basically put together examples of the models I just showed you, where we have the growth release and we have survival. Now this is in height because the seedlings are measured in height and not diameter. So you'll see there's negative growth, and that's just because, and it's pretty prominent for the very slow growers, and it's regular that something dies off or gets eaten, what have you. So that's part of this seedling. They're able to kind of persist and bounce around without growing, really. But then they can respond quickly to resources. The survival, however, indicates one of the importance of responding quickly to resources. You saw some of the model survival curves I had. Well, for really little things, there's this, so in centimeters tall. So, you're talking about this size class, pretty high mortality rates, like low survival rates. And as I told you with the compound interest thing, it's pretty hard to push through a cohort of individuals through this, what we call it the killing zone, to get to whatever this is. Whether or not this is actually some kind of security or not doesn't so much matter when you're here. Point is, very high mortality, and part of this is, we know why, part of this is because there are a lot of tree ferns and a lot of understory herbs that really suppress these smallest, and if you can poke through there, somewhat of a different game. Well, we tried to simulate, we didn't try, we simulated to try to reflect what it means to try to get through this and survive to 2 meters tall, which we're kind of calling 1 centimeter DBH. In other words, what does it take to become a sapling? And so we call this time and effort to reach 1 centimeter. And so these are from simulations based on those growth and survival. And to be clear, we have transition rules, which I can go into detail another time on, when you're suppressed and how much you get released. In other words, we use the data to say, oh, what's the chance that if you're suppressed now, you get, all of a sudden you get a light fleck or something like that and grow more later. And we use those in kind of sensitivity analyses. But the take-home message is quite striking. And that's that passage time in years is how many years from a germinate does it take to become 2 meters? And that's how many years given that you make it. Of course, most don't make it. So then how many seedlings do you have to start with to even make a sapling, okay? And so the most kind of successful at this stage has a little over 20 years from germinate to 2 meters, and takes about 100 seeds to make a sapling. You need to throw 100 down, and one of them is going to take about 20. You go up to the other end, and this is kind of log. So here you have something that takes about 200 years to get to 2 meters, and it takes tens of thousands of seeds. So you're just pouring seeds at this site. And the take home isn't that that's true, that that's actually what happens. It's that for an 18-year study with really good demographic data and coverage, and some fairly simple models and reasonable assumptions, you're getting numbers even anything like that. Basically, when Xiao was getting these results and we'd Skype and he's just like, nothing lives ever, and we're like, we'll put more of that in there, and he's like, oh, it's missing. And in fact, one of them doesn't appear here because it never made it. It's just like, okay, we give up on that. Again, what does it mean? Maybe 3 years from now, there's an El Nino event that really kills off the ferns and all of a sudden they break through. The point is, it's a very difficult life history stage, and there's difficult numbers and difficult data. This is one of the best data sets you're gonna get to say much about it. But I will say this also, when you're looking at recruitment into the census, it made me really think about how when you start to see trees enter the census at 1 centimeter, like we're like, okay, we're tagging you, we're following you from here on out, their history can be wild. They can be young guns that were just like fresh out and lucky and having a great time, and it can be a 200-year-old individual. And we know this, in fact, there in Lambir in Malaysia, which is a very slow-growing forest, there are stems that are 2 centimeters in diameter that were in the first census in 1982. So they were 1 centimeter in 1982 or above, and they're 2 centimeters now. So they just don't grow. You flick them and it hurts your hand because it's just dense wood. So this also says to me that special cases are essential, because in no way do we think we capture the truth of the forest and seedlings. It's that clearly we're saying 5% top growth, maybe 99.99% fastest grower is the one that makes it. Maybe it's the extreme survivors that make up the group that then have to make up the group that become reproductive. And that's just a really interesting way of thinking, as demographically, as we try to model these forests forward, what our expectations are in terms of patterns of survival and growth through these systems. And for this reason, what I'm going to present to you from here on will not include reproduction and recruitment. I think it's fascinating. I think there's really interesting trade-offs with investment, but we focused on growth and survival because those are the big carbon movers that we have good data on. So in this section, I'm going to show a quick project where there are a number of efforts to bring in demography into the models. One of them is in the ecosystem demography 2 model, which is sort of positioned to be a part of an Earth system model, but it's right now a little bit better as a standalone for regional and local questions. But the way it's also part of an initiative to put traits in, demography through traits and wood density in particular. The idea being succession can be reflected in wood density, so pioneer species versus late successional. And the question we ask is, can simulation successful in one region translate to another? And this is, let me just say the successional PFTs, why we're kind of interested in this is now we're taking demography instead of broadleaf, evergreen, what have you, and just saying, what are the patterns through time of these different PFTs? And you can imagine very different forest dynamics in terms of the rate of carbon and then the state of carbon, the vulnerability to disturbance based on these kinds of different plans. So this work was done by Elsa Ordway. She's a postdoc at Harvard University with Mike Moorcroft, and her project is to parameterize ecosystem demography 2 model for Southeast Asia, which is, well, it's different. They've done it for the Amazon, and they feel pretty good about it. I didn't, ask in detail, prove it or anything like that. But they're like, yeah, we're getting things right in the Amazon. You move to Malaysia. This is Cephalok, but the work I'm about to show you is from Lambert, similar forests. These are dipterocarp forests. They're much bigger anyways, and they have emergence that rise up above the background canopy, these things, 65, 85 meters. Really interesting forest, very much slower than those, et cetera. Anyway, so basically, this is what I'm showing you now is not Ilse's dream of life work. This is some quick simulation she did after a workshop when we were together. I'm like, let's just try this. Basically, she said, let's take the Amazon, let's put it in the climate of Lambert, and let's raise the maximum height. There's algorithms that say, like, once you get this big, you stop growing up, you start growing out. It's just part of the models. So let's just raise it so that it can become 55 meters instead of 35 meters. And remarkably, it, like, right away off I bet, kind of nailed it. Above ground biomass is 300 megagrams per hectare in Lambert, 52 hectare plot. And here's her first simulations from bare ground, and they just fly up to around 300. And it just fills the space. And so in other words, the forest just fills the space in, gets higher than the Amazon, and shows the big biomass. Problem. All of this is low wood density early successional wood. And I'm going to show you Lambert later in just a little bit, but this is just a pioneer forest. That is not Lambert. This is a good example of getting the right answer for the wrong reason. We hit the benchmark of 300 megagrams per hectare, but in no way do we have the dynamics of the forest. And so this is one of those examples where you got that right and it's going to go flying off somewhere else. A disturbance hit, a drought hits, and you're going to get it wrong. So we're thinking of taking a step back from this kind of early, mid, late successional and reassessing from our data how we can better represent forests. And so this is a project with Jessie Needham, who's now at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. She was a postdoc at my lab, and with Dan. And we've been working on this for a bunch of years in different ways. And Jessie has really led this and spent incredible energy working with the data, which is not easy, but it's been a really fun project. And just know that she was hired at Berkeley to kind of help bring some of our results into those big models, which I look forward to revisiting with her how that's going. But basically the goal of this project was to ask, what is tree demographic space? What do trees do in growth and survival space? Like, where do they occupy? They're not annuals, they're not Arabidopsis, so that's not it, but what are they? And how do regions of that space behave? And then how do different forests draw from that demographic space? That sounds really far out and esoteric. I'll fill you in a little bit more. It might become more clear. So we took data, the forest geodata, from 20 plots. We used from those 20 plots, 4,000 species, kind of made the grade in terms of sample sizes we need. Total 2.4 million stems, and all these are large plots with stems over 1 centimeter DVH, measured every 5 years. We used one census. And I'd, again, be glad to talk about some of the neat things temporally that can happen, but we just let's not overthink this. This is a big project now. A snapshot of the world's forest demography. What do we see? We fit these curves. Now, these curves are gamma functions. So these are just gamma distributions. And gammas are nice because they're really flexible with just 2 parameters. They can look like that or like that. And then this is 2 logistic functions that we meet in the middle. And the reason why we combine 2 logistic functions is, as I showed you with that little regression of growth, all the data are here for survival. And basically, it will ignore everything from here on out if you just focus on fitting a parametric form with this data. And that's really important because, as I mentioned, small percentage points matter. And if all your data are here, but you're trying to predict, you're not trying to assess who's living and dying, you're trying to predict the future. Well, many, many, many years are spent over here. And a lot of biomass is happening here. So if you let the little things that are popping in and out dictate how you model the long slog to really large biomass, you don't have a chance. So we separate these out and let few data, but nonetheless free data, inform this curve, and let the small data inform this curve. And you can see, because there are confidence intervals here, they're just thousands of observations, and here something died 2 things lived, the thing died. Less certainty. So we did this from these parametric forms. We drew out 5 variables to reflect the demography. Median growth of the fastest growers, median growth of the slowest growers, that stature term, how big can you get, juvenile survival and maximum survival. So those 5 things. We put them into a PCA, as one does, and here's, so the dots are species, the size of them are the number of individuals. We do not correct for that because there's too many different ways you can do that. This has a huge number of individuals. It's probably an understory shrub that could be important and probably a real pain in the ass to measure, but that's what it is. And this one could be an emergent in land beater and be responsible for 30% of the biomass. You know, it's just too, you can overthink it. So we just, let's let the species have parameters, and the parameters in demographic space. And so when I say demographic space of trees, I kind of mean this, you know, like whatever this is like, you can be a tree here and you can't be a tree here, you know, and you can't be a tree up here, and it's harder to be a tree up here. So that's parameter space. I'm showing you 2 dimensions, but we used 4 dimensions. We used all 4 dimensions of the PCA. And here you have the factor loading. So this is survival and this is growth. A couple things to say here. A lot of like the initial efforts in successional demography kind of looked at pioneers and late successional. Think of the slow fast continuum, you know, live fast, die young kind of thing. What are the trade-offs between growth and survival? And we really didn't see a strong trade-off in 2 ways. One, these are somewhat orthogonal. Yes, survival, you know, is opposite growth, but they're somewhat orthogonal. It's not like a real clear story. But I think more importantly, we're not so much concerned with the evolutionary trajectories of these trade-offs, but like, where are the species? What's the composition, demographic composition of the forest? And they're everywhere. You know, they're not clustered here and here as we grow fast and die young, we survive a lot. They're all over. And so what we did instead was to try to aggregate. We didn't try to, we used a k-means clustering algorithm to statistically draw out groups that seem to coalesce in demographic space. And so these are the 8 demographic functional types, that's what we're calling them, that fell out of the PCA. And when we take the parameter values that they reflect, and I'll put them back into those kind of distributional forms that I showed you, this is what you get. Now, I order these according to survival stature, basically. But you see a variation in survival. Sometimes juvenile survival goes down here, sometimes it doesn't. You know, maximum growth bounces around. Sometimes it's all slow growing. Sometimes it's incredible response. Interesting, even things that look very similar, like 2 and 3, can have slight differences in survival that are hard to see here that, as I mentioned, compound. And I'll show you an example of that if we kind of put these together and do those simulations again to look at population level trajectories. You see each of the 8 demographic functional types here displayed in terms of the time and years it takes to become a 10-centimeter tree, so 100 millimeters. Some of our tree species and functional types never get really beyond that because they're just understory trees. And this is the so that's passage time. Life expectancy is, if you're a 1-centimeter tree on average in this group, how long will you live? And here's just a simulation of those populations, a cohort. 10,000 seeds, you know, 10,000 stems at 1 centimeter, put forward with the rule set of our survival, flipping some coins for survival, et cetera. And you see a couple things. 1, 2, and 3 that look similar, very different in terms, survival makes them very different in terms of life expectancies, from 150 or 40 years to 50 years. So in other words, there were slight changes there that are hard to see that really differentiate how long carbon is in the system if you're here or here. You see a variety of trajectories here, interestingly. Across demographic space, you see different ways that trees kind of contribute in very simple simulations, but from this incredible data set to carbon sequestration and carbon residence times. There's a lot of ways to move through that system. So we took these data from global plots. We aggregated them into these demographic functional types. Well, what does the world look like in terms of demographic space? So we put the plots back on. 2 interesting things emerge. one, and it's hard to tell because sometimes it's rare, but pretty much every plot, I think every plot except one, has some member of every demographic type. So in other words, whether you're in the eastern US or in Peninsula Malaysia or Democratic Republic of Congo, you have at least one species from all over that space. Second thing that's more obvious, probably more important, is that plots draw from that demographic space very differently. So they assemble their communities from very different regions of demographic space. And I don't have time to go into it now, but some of the patterns are really interesting, but they're fairly specific. Like that's a cyclone forest. That's a forest with dipterocarp. That forest had an El Nino event. Like so some of these stories are defined by that, but I am going to focus in on something I think is very telling, and that's Lambir and Paso. That's those over there. So these are two plots in Malaysia. One is in Borneo and one is in Peninsula Malaysia. They're everwet, aseasonal, lowland dipterocarp rainforests, large, slow-growing, stable climate. Paso is affected by El Ninos a little bit more signs of masting and stuff like that, response to El Ninos. Paso also has a population of wild pigs that go in and root around and pull up saplings. Those two things, and probably some other things, have clearly pulled Paso and Lambir away from each other in demographic space. There is no model with less than 5,000 PFTs that wouldn't put these plots together in a model. I mean, these are tropical evergreen broadleaf rainforests. And I think this is really telling that the difference in these dynamics seen here from demographic space shows some distinctions that would be invisible to just trying to characterize the kind of the growth form and leaf form and the latitude of the plots. Lambir, of course, is the plot that was used in this simulation. And it's worth noting that the reason we were disappointed with the result is not only is this not a pioneer forest, it is like there's not even a pioneer species there as one. The pioneers of Lambir are the old, late successional of a place like Panama, Barra, Colorado. This is a very slow growing, like I said, this is the one with the stems that go a centimeter in 40 years. Huge trees, big biomass, but it's made up of really a slow forest, a slow, very dense forest, not a lot of light gaps. And so essentially, if you're missing these aspects of Lambir, and whether you're asking what's Lambir going to do in the future, or you're looking at the secondary forests around Lambir, or Lambir gets cut down, whatever it is, if you're trying to model and predict the future response of a forest like that, and you're not capturing the fact that its demography is dictating a very special pathway forward, you're going to miss really important features of the forest. So again, it's instead of 8 plant functional types, we're looking at 8 demographic types. So it's not trying to add a lot of complexity. I'm just trying to come at it from a different way and say maybe a plot isn't just broadleaf deciduous, but it draws from this part of demographic space. Now, it's easy for me to say that. It's a different matter trying to put it in the models. And so I'm not sitting here saying, like, I'll wait for you and expect results soon. But I'm excited, and they're really smart people working on these models, and it's really fun to talk about these things. And I think that's when they were excited, and that's one reason why Jessie got that job. And I'm looking forward to seeing her work towards this. But so path forwards, the big one for me that I presented here is bring better demography into PFT parameters and rule sets and vegetation levels. So let's get that in there and do a better job of it. I think there's a flip side of that, which is my responsibility, which is study the physiology and physiological mechanisms that drive demographic forms, because that's what those models use. They use photosynthetic rates and water transport and rooting depths and stuff like that. So I can show you a big pattern from Lambir and say, put that in your model, and they say, can you tell us about the photosynthetic activity of this? What's max, Vmax, what's the hydraulic dynamics going on in those emergence? And so it kind of behooves me to start looking into that stuff so that we can communicate this better. Interesting and new and different ways to monitor. I love that the plot network is fantastic. There's a lot of inventory that gives us great demographic data, but linking that to other monitoring systems, remote sensing, trait collection, genomics collections, many other monitoring approaches linking to the kinds of demographic traits and spaces that I'm showing you, I think will also help. Say, Lambier and Paso I show you, but those are just points on a plot. Like, let's get the region, and that's going to require something a little more comprehensive than what I'm showing you. And then I think very importantly, investigate the human interactions with tree demographic forms. I mean, that's not something we do much, at least in my group, but we all know it's important, and it's kind of like the modelers know demography is important, but they do that. I think we need to work with the people that think about how humans use forests, replant forests, abandon forests, abandoned plantations for forests, and in the context of what I'm showing you, because I showed you a trajectory from bare ground of Lambier that I said is wrong. Well, what's the right one? Because it's not going to be just old growth trees growing slowly. It's going to be some remnants, and so thinking about secondary forest restoration, plantations and planning for biodiversity, planning for carbon, whatever it is, I think that we need to be communicating these kinds of data and these kinds of results to this that kind of planning. So with that, thanks to the folks that you've already seen and funding, and thanks for listening today. I appreciate it. I'm glad to take any questions.